Chapter 15 looks at gender and leadership, the differences, the commonalities, and other themes having to do with men and women in leadership. So, what is this approach to leadership? Well, it's basically looking at some various questions that are presented in research that people are interested in today. So what are some of these research questions? Well, do men and women lead differently? Do they have tendencies to do something? Do men and women have differences, and in what ways are they similar? Another question, another research question, are men leaders more effective than women leaders, or are women leaders more effective than men? That's an important question, and under what conditions might one gender be more effective than the other? And a third set of questions, and that's what a lot of this chapter focuses on, is why are women underrepresented in elite leadership roles? Why are most leadership roles in organizations and in politics occupied by men? So traditionally, women in leadership has been viewed through the metaphor of the glass ceiling. That women can get up so far, but getting beyond a certain level is really difficult. It's like there's a glass ceiling above them, keeping them down. Well, that was used for a while, but now the metaphor that's being used is a labyrinth. A labyrinth is a maze, and some women do make it to the top of leadership, and the question is, why? And what type of route through this maze do they take to get there? Now, what is the situation of women in leadership? So, currently, women outnumber men in higher education in the U.S. They earn 57% of all bachelor's degrees, 60% of all master's degrees, more than 50% of doctorates, and nearly half of the professional degrees, like for doctors and dentists and lawyers. So women are getting a lot more education than men are, but they make up less than half of the U.S. labor force. They're 47% of people that are employed in organizations, but they make up 51% of the population. And they're still underrepresented in upper leadership of corporations and the political systems. And this lack of representation is what's called the gender gap in leadership. And there are three types of explanations. And that's what this image, and this is the main image on this in the chapter for understanding the labyrinth. And so we've got a labyrinth in the background there, and then we've got three groups of factors that contribute to understanding the labyrinth. The first is human capital. For example, women are getting educated more and more. They're getting educated more than men, and so that's enabling them to go into more leadership positions, but at the same time, they tend not to major in the technical fields, such as math and science and engineering, which can give them the technical expertise to move into leadership, especially in technological fields. There's the question of work experience. Women get an awful lot of work experience, but at the same time, a large number of women take time off to raise a family. And as anyone who's taken time off, like I did, I was a pastor for 17 years, once you come back, it's really hard to start and build on the previous experience that you had. You almost have to kind of start over. Then there's also the question of developmental opportunities. Sometimes it's really hard for women to have as many developmental opportunities as men do, especially when they're based on personal relationships, because men are sometimes hesitant to get close and mentor women, because that can turn sexual really quickly, or if things don't go well, the man can be accused of sexual harassment. And so a lot of men invest more of their friendship time into other men than into women. And similarly, there's a lot of developmental opportunities that involve traveling and conferences and things like that. And a lot of women, when they have children in the home don't especially want to go away for a week-long conference or things like that. And then a big one is work-home conflict. Women in all the studies put a greater emphasis on housework and taking care of children than men do. In fact, a really interesting study is that when somebody has their first child, men say, ooh, I need to work harder, and they end up working more hours. Women tend to want to stay home with the child, and they end up working less hours. So women experience a lot of what's known as a work-home conflict, where they feel pressure to be at home, especially with children. So that's the human capital factor. Now, there's also the question of gender differences. Men and women are different, and so they might have differences in style and effectiveness. Even if they use the same style, they might not have the same level of effectiveness. There's commitment and motivation is generally the same when we study commitment and motivation. But when we see how that plays out, we can see that there are some differences in genders. The question of self-promotion. Women tend not to self-promote. They tend not to volunteer, to promote themselves, to take on new responsibilities as much as men do. And then in the whole question of negotiation, men tend to be a lot more willing to negotiate and to leap in and try to negotiate things, where women tend to not negotiate things as well. And that's a real hot topic of research. And then there's the question of prejudice. So because there's gender differences, there's gender stereotypes that develop. And these can lead to biased perceptions and evaluations. For example, we know that men are more willing to negotiate than women, but there are a lot of women who are really good negotiators. But prejudice affects women, especially women who are good negotiators, because somebody can say, she's a woman, she's not going to be a good negotiator. So that's why prejudice can be dangerous and very detrimental to a lot of women. So these are three groups of factors that that help us understand the gender labyrinth that women have to go through to get to leadership. Now, this question, especially of prejudice, is extremely interesting. People have what are known as gendered expectations. People expect people of one gender to do one thing, and the other gender to do other different things. And so gendered expectations explain a lot of the findings concerning the gender gap. Women are facing cross pressures in two different directions. They need to be tough to be leaders, because leaders need to make really difficult decisions in order to accomplish the goals that they need to do, but they're at pressure at the same time not to be too manly. Women tend to want to be, men and women tend to expect women to be feminine, and they expect men to be masculine, and so these expectations affect how we view people. If a woman is considered too manly, she's not considered ladylike, and she can make enemies real quickly. So women have greater difficulty to be viewed as effective top leaders when they're in a leadership role, because if they act like men would act as a leader, people don't like them, because they don't fit the gender expectations. They're not acting like what people expect women to look like. So essentially, there's penalties for women who violate gender stereotypes. People tend not to like manly women, and they tend not to like feminine men, and so that can hinder people in developing their relationships. Now let's look at some of the strengths and the weaknesses of this approach to leadership. First of all, understanding the research in gender and leadership can help promote more women into upper echelons of leadership, which can be good for women who want to get involved in leadership. And it also can be good for others because women are more likely to use democratic, participative styles of leadership rather than dictatorial styles, which tend to be very much preferred by males than females. Then the research on gender and leadership is also productive and useful in both dispelling myths about the gender gap and shining a light on aspects of gender barrier that are difficult to see. It just gives us better understanding of what happens. Now, what are some of the criticisms? What are some of the weaknesses of these studies? Well, one is that the role of biological differences is often ignored in leadership studies. It's not a hot topic, it's not politically correct, it's not what sells books or what editors want, so a lot of people shy away from looking at the actual biological differences between males and females and how that affects their leadership. And it leads to a lot of unanswered questions. For example, is it appropriate to consider domestic leadership, leadership in the home, like child raising and stuff, less important than organizational leadership? Because we're always presented with this idea that, oh yeah, organizational leadership is really what's important, what people need to aim for. But is domestic leadership just as important in raising up children in the next generation? Another type of question that could come up is it realistic to expect men and women to be equally concerned about domestic duties? Because that's always one of the recommendations. Oh, men need to be more concerned about domestic duties so that women don't spend as much time as they do, and they can spend more time at work like men do. For example, women tend to spend a lot of time doing housework, buying clothes for children, things like that. But there are some things that men spend more time doing, like car maintenance and mechanical things like that. So these are just examples of some of the questions that need to be further developed to understand the role of gender and leadership. Now, you know that Azusa Pacific is a Christian university, and I try to end all of these talks with a biblical reflection. Now, when we look at the differences between genders, we see that there's a number of traits that are considered masculine and a number of traits that are considered feminine. And when we look at leadership, and when we also look at God, we can see the importance of both types of traits. And it's interesting that even thousands of years ago in the book of Genesis, it says, God created humans in his own likeness, male and female, he created them. Even for understanding God and the way that he interacts with the world, we need to understand both males and females, because humans, the thing that distinguishes humans from the rest of life is that we're created in God's image, and we need to understand both we need to look at both males and females to understand what this likeness actually is. And so we can't say, oh, everybody needs to be more male-like or female-like is the most effective type of leadership. No, we need to look at all of these traits that are considered both traditionally male and female, and that will give us a picture of a good leader, and it'll also give us a more full picture of who God is.